If David comes, I'll defer to him, but we'll go ahead and get started. And as we usually do, we'll think about folks who might be in need of prayer today. And we've mentioned David Hicks, who is David still in the care facility, Tom?
Don't really know for sure. He was home. What last I heard was he's not.
He didn't come home. I don't think he can come home right now. He can't walk. And I believe he's at the Oaks. I'd like for us to remember John and Wanda Woodward. A lot of you may not know them, but they are members of this church. And John has Alzheimer's and is in hospice at Novant as we speak. So I told Wanda that I would ask for prayers for them and for their family.
Many of you may know Allison Ray, who is a member of our church and a neighbor, and her mother had a stroke the other day and is not expected to survive. So she's down in Marietta with her sister as they are with their mother.
Allison Ray.
Yes.
Yeah, you knew Alice. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I'm going to start us off today with a poem by Wendell Berry. Many of you have probably heard of him. But first, I did not realize this, but Easter is more than Easter Day. That there is an Easter season that, from what I read, extends 50 days beyond Easter Sunday. And so we're still in that Easter celebration and that Easter tide. And so this poem by Barry kind of invites us to stay in that place of wonder and of joy. So I'm going to read this to you. So friends, every day, do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world. Work for nothing. Take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Hope to live in a free republic. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance for what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest, when they have rotted into the mold. Call that prophecy such returns. Go with your love to the fields, lie easy in the shade, rest your head in their lap. Swear allegiance to what is highest in your thoughts. As soon as the generals and politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail, the way you didn't go. Be like the fox, who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection. So this Barry reminds us we're all invited to remain in our resurrection space and celebrate for another 30 days at least. So
I love the plant sequoias.
I know, and that's so Wendell Berry too, isn't it? Yeah. So we're shifting gears today. We're moving into the Gospel of John. We've been talking about Luke, and Carolyn says she's been thinking about the road to Emmaus all week. So I'm glad that what we do here sometimes can generate conversation throughout the week, and certainly does for me. But we're moving into John, and I thought I'd do a little refresher and raised some new questions about this gospel that I've encountered in my studies recently. First, John is, as we know, the fourth gospel. It is not one of the texts we call the synoptic gospels. Remember, we've used that term before. Synoptics are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Because of the resemblances and kind of they seem to fit together. John, on the other hand, is kind of a different take on the life and the ministry and the theology of Jesus and what Jesus means. It's probably the oldest of the Gospels, written latest. Most scholars say anywhere between like 90 to 120 AD. So it's the oldest of the Gospels. And we've talked about like various sources for these books. Scholars think that one of the sources that the writer of the Gospel of John used was something called the signs source, because signs play a huge role in the composition of this gospel. That what we call the miracles, maybe in Matthew or Luke, are called signs in the Gospel of John. So the signs gospel. And
signs meaning what?
Let this be a sign unto you, that when Jesus does miraculous things, he'll usually say this is a sign pointing to God. So when you read through the gospel, you'll see that a lot. The sign, semenia is the Greek for it. So there are some, different characteristics to the gospel. Eusebius, who was an early Christian writer, called it the spiritual gospel, because much of it is interested in the spiritual nature of who Jesus is. And if you remember the very beginning of the gospel, there's a whole prologue. So can y'all remember the very first line of the Gospel of John?
In the beginning was the Word.
Was the Word. Word was
With God.
right. Yeah.
With God.
So that whole prologue, that's very different beginning than the synoptic gospels, which go through genealogies and have a birth narrative. John doesn't have that. John goes straight to this explication, this lengthy description that Jesus is the Word and Jesus was with God. So there are definitely different characteristics to the gospel. And I want to talk a little bit about where this text may have originated, and I hope that you will bear with me because I sent Jane to look. Remember how we used to have maps here?
I could not find
We
them.
can't find the maps. So I have endeavored to draw a very poor map of the Levant and Asia Minor. Okay. Here is Palestine, right? Okay, so let's say Jerusalem's down here. Okay, here's Athens, Greece. Okay, and this is Asia Minor. Okay, and I'm going to say this is F. So, most scholars think that this gospel was written here in Ephesus in Asia Minor. Right. So, part of the reason why this is maybe considered more of a later gospel is because the message has moved, right, all throughout this Mediterranean basin. We know Paul went up into Greece, and Corinth is here, and this is Crete. So we've had this spread of early Christian thought that has kind of disseminated all throughout this region. And, by, let's say, earliest, 80, 90, it's reached Ephesus. And scholars traditionally have, in the modern times, have said that a school developed, that one of them would be noted as the Johannine school. So if you think about different books like 1 John, those epistles, those letters, like there's 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. Traditionally, scholars have said that those letters came out of this group of people who were associated with the writer of the Gospel of John. They weren't necessarily the same person, but they kind of came out of this Johannine community. So we have this group here in Ephesus that's writing, that has taken some different sources and has structured, its gospel differently than Jerusalem, the communities that have come out of Jerusalem and the Levant in this area. So
you would say they're different from the Pauline community.
Yeah.
Would that have been called, that area, Anatolia?
That's Greece, isn't it? I don't
I
know.
think it's more Turkey.
Is it more Turkey? I'm looking at Jane, who's been there.
Well, there's Antalya currently is a newer name in Turkey.
Yeah,
So
so
that's a coastal community.
Yeah. So you had, scholars think that these different communities of very early Christians developed throughout, the region. And one other aspect of John that can be problematic is it is an exclusionary vision that has some harsh language about Jews. And, that's problematic and has been problematic throughout the ages. But I was reading Amy Jill Levine, who is a Jewish woman who does a whole lot of great work in Christian texts too. And what she advises Christians to do is don't shy away from that language, but understand that it was written in a particular time and place. And a lot of scholars think that the Gospel of John was written during a time. Do you remember the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was 70 AD? So this was written after that really cataclysmic event in the life of the Jewish communities. And there were Jewish communities all throughout this area, part of that early diaspora of Judaism. So, there was the destruction of the temple. There was this growing, nascent Christian movement within Judaism. And at certain points, that created tension between the people who were claiming Jesus as Messiah within the synagogues and the Jewish folks there who did not. So some folks think that the Gospel of John not only reflects an understanding of Jesus and tells that story, but there's kind of a subtext of this tension between the synagogue and the growing Christian communities that are coming out of them and are being expelled from the synagogue because of their views. So that can kind of explain that harsh language in there. It's a little bit of background. We're going to stay in John next week. And so next week, I want to give you kind of a more, like within the last 2 years, a view from scholars that are challenging this notion of a Johannine community, but we'll save that for next week. But today we're going to focus on chapter 21, the first part of chapter 21. And I think it's in your lesson that folks think that chapter 21 was an addition to the original text of this gospel, that it was added later by an editor.
The phrase that keeps bothering me is the disciple that Jesus loved. Now, is this something that says pretty good indication that this is somebody else other than John or one person writing this thing? Because if he's talking about himself, he's sort of conceited.
That is a very good question. And you'll get different answers depending on who you read.
Well, I came from the Baptist church.
Okay.
And when you read John, you knew that John wrote it. And if you saw Luke wrote it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I came into this class about 10 years ago, and Sam Maloney was teaching, and the first thing he started talking about was who wrote the book. I don't remember which book, you know, and I said, what? And I've seen this in the Presbyterian church. I laugh about it because I said the first thing we do as Presbyterians is we try to figure out who didn't write the book.
That's very true. And I'll tell y'all this story. Some of you may have heard it before. I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and the very first class I had was Old Testament 101, the OT 101. And so they had it, you know, it's an introductory course, so they have it in the big, you know, auditorium-ish place. So we get in there, and the professor was just this larger-than-life guy named Jimmy Jack McKee Roberts. And Jimmy Jack was a Disciples of Christ Texan. And when I mean Texan, he had the hat, he had the boots, he had the belt. So he walks into the podium and kind of puts his stuff down, stands there, and he kind of looked like Clint Eastwood and looks at everybody and goes, Moses did not write the Pentateuch. And there were gasps in the back. My more like fundamentalist friends, my Baptist friends maybe, had never heard that. And that was quite a challenge. I mean, yeah, I grew up Presbyterian and took some religion classes. I didn't take one from Sam. But so I kind of knew that.
Now, what's your personal opinion? What with all of that?
Personally?
Mm-hmm.
I think that I tend to take scholarship very seriously. There's, you know, if you look at research, probably from the beginning of the 20th century, we've had access to tools like archaeology and linguistics that, you know, earlier interpreters never had. So applying scholarship and applying those tools to the study of the text, I find that it enlivens and expands, you know, my understanding of the readings.
Would you, but this thing, my nagging question I had about the disciple that loved Jesus.
Beloved disciple.
Jesus loved. What's your opinion of? Is this sort of some suspicion that maybe it's other authors or?
I think that I don't think the beloved disciple wrote this. Yeah, but what I think is that the beloved disciple functions as on many different levels, depending on what hermeneutic you're looking at, that Jesus had a very close relationship with a particular person. And that's significant because when John, you know, describes that. There's almost a sense of blending some authenticity to the story. But there are many levels of how that functions in the text.
Thank you. I didn't mean to
I know,
chase rabbits on you.
That's all right, we can go down rabbit holes.
My daddy said Pentateuch was written by Moses or by some other fellow with the same name.
We don't know. We don't know. But yeah, I mean, authorial attribution is hard. And we'll get into this more next week. There's something called pseudepigrapha, which is false, if you break the word down, false writers. And to your point about Paul, I mean, we pretty much have come to the conclusion that some of the Pauline letters were not written by Paul. And that writers in the ancient Near East and the ancient world would oftentimes take a famous writer's name and write under that name for several reasons. One being that it would enhance their credibility. It'd be like if I decided to write a novel under the name of Ernest Hemingway. I'm writing, but I'm saying Ernest Hemingway wrote it. What I would do is I would adopt some of Hemingway's style, maybe some of Hemingway's themes, but I'm not Ernest Hemingway. But what I would hope is that people would see that name and be like, oh my God, this is going to be a great novel. And they'll pick it up and they'll read it. So that's how
another issue is, where did it transform from the oral to the written? And they could attribute it to Moses, but that might have been a number of oral traditions coming in, and they were compiling them into a single story.
Exactly. Yeah.
As long as we take the Bible seriously, we don't necessarily have to take it literally.
Yay! That's the best quote ever.
Take it seriously.
That's true. And I say that to, some of my more literalist friends, and I kind of rephrase it. I say, I take the Bible too seriously to take it literally. And that's what I hope we can do. As we do in this class, that's what Sam did. And he set the tone for kind of how we approach the study together. So, but back to chapter 21, we're going to talk some fishing, because we have a text, and the setting is Jesus returning to some of his followers. And I'm going to read through the scripture. It's chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus sat on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Sound familiar? Okay, so Jesus said to them, children, have you no fish, have you? They answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved, our beloved disciple, said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far away from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. Though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Okay. So Carolyn, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to tell everybody the story you told me about your conversation about a carpenter telling them.
Oh, I said to Tom, if you were a professional fisherman and you had fished all night and had not caught anything, and a carpenter came along the shore and told you to try on the other side, would you do it? And he said, probably not.
I was thinking, if I was naked, I wouldn't put on my clothes to dive into the ocean.
Isn't that strange?
Is that right?
That is such a strange little insertion there, isn't it? And I actually tried to find some sort of explication of it, and nothing seemed very persuasive. I just think it's a strange little bit. But we start this text, with a setting that these disciples are in the Sea of Tiberias, and there's kind of a different cast of characters than we become accustomed to in the other Gospels. Like Nathaniel of Cana isn't someone we hear about a lot. The sons of Zebedee and Thomas, called the twin. They're a little bit different. But we have Simon Peter, who's kind of the main character in this, and will become prominent as we go through this chapter. So we have our cast of characters, we have our setting, and then just after daybreak, Jesus appears. Another interesting point to this text that you kind of raise is, unlike the other Gospels where we know and the authors tell us that many of them were professional fishermen, we don't have that earlier description of them as fishermen. So this is kind of the first time we see these folks in a setting fishing. So they may not have been very good at fishing. We don't know. But Jesus comes up to them and says, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" You have no fish. Jane.
Is there anything in broader contextual references that, to your point, okay, you're in a society that, is primary sustenance agrarian? Is it, but hey, we live in a coastal place and there are fish, whereas, would there have been routine trade so that you would have professional fishermen? Mm-hmm. Or would it be that the average person would say, okay, today, Tom's doing it, then Bill, then, and it may have rotated around a community. Have you ever read anything that talked about it in either one and or both of those kind of?
Yeah, my recollection is that there were, I guess a guild would be the best analogy. Like you have carpenters, you have, threshers, you have people during that time that did specialize in certain things. So from what I recall, you would have professional fishermen. But they were considered like laborers, lower class people, Unlike when Jane and I went to Hawaii, we went deep sea fishing, and that costs a pretty penny. So it's like To fish nowadays costs a lot of money. But, nowadays, back then, they could go out and try to catch some. But, so maybe they were professional fishermen, maybe they weren't. But they'd been out all night trying to get some fish, and they didn't get it. Jesus appears and tells them, try the other side. And then they cast it, and they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. The allusions to Jesus multiplying the fish, the bread, that the presence of Jesus brings not only success in getting the fish, but abundance of fish, more than they could use, reminds, you hear the echoes of those earlier stories in this. And who's the first? Hey, David.
Time change got me, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Did you all remember to set your clocks? Time change?
It ain't working. You're late.
That's okay, welcome.
We had, Tammy's friends had a shower yesterday for her prospective new daughter-in-law on James Bride. And so her parents were our house guests, and Tammy said, I gotta go, Tammy. She said, oh, you gotta sit down and have breakfast with us. I didn't have my watch on, so
Family relations come first,
I'm
especially with the future in-laws. That's important.
So they were our guests. So please excuse me.
Oh, no problem.
Earlier, late, you're as welcome as a.
Yeah, right.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
When
Right.
James and John were called, weren't they at the water at the boat
Mm-hmm.
in the synoptic?
Mm-hmm. Right. But we don't have that type of call narrative here.
Mhm.
So it's kind of the first time we have any disciples in a context where they're fishing.
But that supports the fact that they were fishermen, doesn't it?
Yeah, in the synoptics. And again, we don't know. There's a lot of debate on whether the author of John had read those stories, heard those stories. It's quite possible. And it may be that it was so taken for granted, so well known that they were fishermen, that this author didn't feel the need to establish that earlier in the story. Tom?
Some years ago, Carolyn and I went on a tour with a retired minister from First Baptist, and we wound up on the Lake of Tiberias, which
Really?
is what we call the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
And the most unusual thing, they had planted, and the boat we were on pulled in, and there was a restaurant there on there. Somewhere, I don't have any idea where it was on that. And we went in, and they served us what they claimed was a local fish. It was, what was the name of it? St. Peter fish. Yeah, St. Peter fish, and pretty good too. But you saw the Sea of Galilee, which probably hasn't changed that much since Jesus was there, as far as that part. And it just gives us an experience that we we'll never forget.
Someone told me that the most predominant fish in that area was, I can't think of the name of it, tilapia. And I don't know if that's true or not, but somehow when I eat tilapia, I
Think of that?
connect it with something holy.
Huh. Yeah. How big of a sea is it, Tom? Can you give us some?
I don't know. My memory is exaggerated, and I don't know. I was telling Carolyn, we were trying to realize what we saw, and it wasn't as big as I thought it would be. You could see the other side of it, like Lake Lorman. It was certainly a sizable lake and a big lake, but it wasn't anything like like our sounds in the eastern part of the state. So you could see at times, you could see the other shore all right. I wouldn't want to have been there on a wooden boat, I don't believe, but it was a typical lake. There was no waves to it. It was just,
The Golan Heights come down to the shore,
Right.
and one of the interpretations I recall about the storm coming up on the sea is that, occasionally when the wind gets up, it funnels
Down through
coming
the,
down the heights there and creates a sudden storm on the water.
yeah.
Mhm.
The term, the word sea to me always kind of conjured up a much larger body of water, like Mediterranean Sea, but, I do know it's
in my
small.
mind, and I don't know whether that's accurate or not, it's like you've cut out a section of Lake Norman.
The Google says it's bigger than Lake Norman.
Okay.
So, not that I just
It's right
checked,
there.
but it says that Lake Norman is 32,000 square acres, or 32,000 acres, and says that the Sea of Galilee is 41,000, according to the Google.
Okay, so a little bit bigger than Lake Norman.
But that would give you, even though we know that topographically, since Lake Norman was created, because it's always said because of the coastline of its size, but presumably that would mean that you've got I didn't ask you what the coastline was, but in excess of 600 miles of coastline.
A large lake.
It goes all the way up to Hickory, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Very long.
But-
Well, the other thing is they were fishing with nets.
Right.
Okay, so it's fish school. But to me, it's very plausible. You can fish all night and not throw into a school of fish,
Right.
but you could on the next cast.
Mm-hmm. And even just slightly changing your location, you can capture those fish. So we have them fishing, and then they decide to take the advice of this wandering carpenter, and they cast the other side, and they catch so many fish. And it is the beloved disciple who first recognizes and says, "It is the Lord." So that, beloved disciple and Jesus having had that very close relationship, it is he who first recognizes him.
No, Heather,
Yes.
I have wondered in Peter saying, I'm going fishing. Could that have been some times of doubt of, we've had these 3 years, but he's gone. And what do we do now?
Mhm.
Do we wait? He said, he wants them to wait, but maybe he hasn't said that yet. And so they go back to a former way of life.
Yeah.
And then Jesus appears, maybe to remind them it's not over.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
I think,
You need to stick with me now. It's not over.
I think you're absolutely right, Carolyn. Because that's what I envision too, is, Jesus has been, to their mind, killed. It's over. So what do? You go back to your old life. And then this reappearance triggers that new way of life. And then we have Peter putting on clothes and jumping in the water. Don't know why. But the other disciples came in the boat dragging the net full of fish, and they were not far from the land. So when they got ashore, they saw something, that it had been already prepared for there to be a breakfast. And again, I hear, the echoes of feeding the multitudes. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter hauled the net ashore full of large fish. And how many of them were there?
153.
153. What does that mean?
There's not a 7 in it.
Not a 7 in it.
A lot of fish to be cleaned.
A lot of fish to be cleaned. Now, I think our lesson talks a little bit about the possibilities of symbolism in that number, and we know from our earlier studies that, numbers have meaning oftentimes in the Hebrew scriptures and also in the New Testament texts, like 7 being the whole or the completion. And so over time, people have tried to make sense of what 153 means. Is it code for something? And I saw a really elaborate, I don't even know the name for it, but breaking down the numbers, and that there was some hidden meaning in 153. But some scholars say that giving kind of a random number like that lends credibility to it. If the writer had said there were 70 fish, a reader maybe or a listener at that time might say, okay, well, that's a complete number of fish. Or if you had said maybe there were 10 fish, they'd say, well, that's just a convenient number. So 153 is really specific. And so some people think, well, that's why the writer put that in there, that it's a detail in the story that lends verisimilitude. Or Jane, did you? Okay.
Where is the story of Jesus walking on the water to the disciples? Well, this to me
has some similarities to that. That's in the Synoptics too.
Okay.
Trying to think, is that in John as well?
I think it's in the synopsis.
Yeah.
But you got him out away from the disciples. Did they recognize him at first, walking towards them?
I think so.
Okay.
So.
Somebody explained his walking on the water by saying he knew where the stones were.
Well, these aren't real. I remember reading at one point in time that, these are some of these lakes, the water draws down and like walking on a sandbar. But that takes a little bit away from the spiritual element of it. But yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of allusions and things of, Jesus walking on the water, Jesus being in the boat and calming the sea. And now we have Jesus here in this scene where he's already prepared the fire and is inviting the disciples to come eat with him, reminiscent a bit of the loaves and fishes, and also somewhat reminiscent to me of the Last Supper, that act of eating with, sharing food with the disciples.
You have this in the Emmaus story.
That's right.
That's right. And it reminds you of the feeding of 5,000 where he broke the bread.
So,
is there anything too that this would have been the first meal with them in a post-resurrection, right?
in John,
Yeah. So do you have it that the Last Supper, again, breakfast, lunch, dinner, supper, all of those namings, is there any significance that this is breakfast, breaking the fast, a morning meal with them? I don't know.
So Jesus invites them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared to ask, who are you? Why? Because they knew it was the Lord by that point in time. So the beloved disciple was the first to say, it is the Lord. But after this invitation, seeing that the fires have been prepared, they are invited to join in that meal. Because what happened and we're conflating a bit, but going to the Synoptics, going to Luke, it was when the two travelers ate with Jesus that they recognized him, right? So again, it's this being that communal act of eating with Jesus helped them see who he was.
But they seemed like we're still having trouble recognizing him physically. And that's odd to me, that even when they were close, had his appearance changed that much? That it was more the way he acted than the physical appearances.
I don't know.
I mean, have we totally defined that post-resurrection that he had, that not that he was like a walking ghost or anything, but, that flesh of flesh,
Well, I mean, we have the,
touch my side.
touch my side, and, that the texts want to make it clear that this is an embodied, this is an embodied thing. This is an embodied being, that we're not dealing with an apparition or a spirit that if you touched, would go right through. So
I used to read this. I thought, when I was a kid, I thought Jesus was a ghost.
uh-huh.
And I sort of live with that, but my feeling right now was he was a person who had been in the tomb for, 2 days, or I forget the number of days. I imagine he had several things. I doubt he was very pleasant to be around.
A little worse for the wear after 2 days.
And it was physical. That's the thing you have to keep making the point to them is you're not looking at the spirit, you're looking at your Savior. And I don't know, if you can imagine somebody being resurrected in the modern day, you make your hair stand on end, but
Yeah. And conversely, there's also, Jesus raised in glory in the radiance the risen Christ. So it could be either or, both and. But I think that there was something about his physical appearance that made it difficult for them to recognize him. And also, they had heard or seen themselves that he was dead, which any one of us, which I think any one of us, if we saw someone who we knew was dead right in front of us, would be a very disconcerting, at the very least, experience.
you see that the lesson writer told an instance where
Yeah, that was funny.
Where I don't remember all the details, but there was a guy had died and his twin was standing there.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of
So
him out.
Yeah, so in the lesson, the writer talks about being invited to a funeral. Was he doing the funeral, or?
I think he was.
Yeah, he was asked to do a funeral for a guy who had passed away, but unbeknownst to him, the man who had died had a twin. So this pastor walks into the church and is greeted by the twin brother, and it freaked the pastor out, to say the least. But yeah, so the appearance may have been worse, may have been better, but they did struggle to recognize him physically. But some of the questions about this particular story, when we read it and kind of apply it to our own lives, is how does this story, what does it teach us about our ability to recognize the presence of Jesus in our own lives and in the things that we go about doing in day to day?
We don't always recognize. And sometimes we can look back in our life and think, Jesus was really guiding me in that decision. I didn't know it at the time.
Remember the story about the footprints in the sand? There was 2 footprints, and then for a period of time, there was 1 footprint. And the lady said, why was there only 1 footprint there? And Jesus said, that was the time I was carrying you.
So what I hear y'all saying is that we sometimes do, in retrospect, say, oh, wow, Jesus was present in this experience. But there's a bit of a challenge, I think, inherent in this text for us to maybe learn to recognize in that moment when Jesus is present with us. One of the things that I've always heard and try to keep in mind is, that, and it ties back to, what you do unto others, you do unto me. That when we try to see Jesus within other human beings, that can be a way for us to see Jesus in that moment. I think there are many examples of that. And in one, has been our Room in the Inn program that, we bring in our guests, many of whom we don't know, many of whom have very different life experiences than we do. But, that is an opportunity. And I've never made fish, but, we share a meal. And in that, we can recognize Jesus within the humans that, come and eat with us. So that's kind of an example that comes to my mind of how we can try to practice what I think this text is inviting us to do, which is, to share hospitality with one another and use that as an opportunity to see Jesus in one another. Any other comments on this lesson for today?
So there's a metaphor that Charlie was talking about. Where is Jesus? What does he look like? When do we see him? So there are all those intersections in our lives that could be any one of those intersections. Any one of those.
I found all the exegesis in this lesson disquieting because it ruined a sermon that I had in my.
Oh, no. How that, in what way?
We won't tell anybody, Bill.
Well, I had taken the passage, I think Luke 4:5, where Jesus by the water, and juxtaposed it with this passage here, and made an application that probably wouldn't meet
That's
the
okay.
exegesis of this lady.
We can do that.
This gentleman.
Yeah. And, when we talk about kind of the scholarship and authorial, applications and all that other stuff, I don't think within like the pastoral and the preaching that we're limited. I think it's important to take, different things and juxtapose them or compare them. So don't feel shackled by the scholarship, but it can be a means to maybe expand our understanding of it. So. All right. Well, I think we're getting the nod from Jane for me to shut up for today. But we'll be back next week and we'll continue on in this chapter. And we'll have Simon Peter and Jesus having a discussion. So we'll close in prayer. Loving Lord, you invite us in communion with you every day and throughout our lives. We ask that you would help us recognize and see you in all of God's children. We ask for your blessing and your peace for those in our congregation who are suffering from illness or struggling with the loss of a loved one. We ask for your blessing upon us as we go forth into the world this week. May you give us eyes to see and hands to serve. We ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.